Well, thank you, Edgar. Dr. Soto, I really appreciate the opportunity to work with your class and have an interactive discussion, and we truly have an international experience right now because you all are obviously in Puerto Rico, I'm obviously in Florida, and my assistant, who is helping run the slideshow, she's in the Philippines. So through technology, we're able to converse from around the world and make this presentation possible, and the opportunity to share my experience with anyone is an awesome gift, and thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Just for some housekeeping rules for the presentation is I'll go through the presentation, and then at the end we'll open it up for questions. That way, as I'm going through things and you may have some ideas, just write them down. And as we get to the end, I'll open it up for questions. We'll go through all the questions, and if for some reason we run out of time, email me those questions, and then I can respond back to you in a way that I can answer your questions. I don't want anyone to leave today with any questions that they may have about the presentation today. Does that sound fair? Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it over to the presentation. Ron, go ahead, next slide, please. Next slide. So what you see there, this is a slide of me when I was actually in Kenya in Africa, and where I spent the Gulf, or the last Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was at a base unit, and then I was with a deployable unit. And the slide I just shared with you was when I was in Kenya, off the coast of Kenya, doing an operation in Kenya. And what you saw there was a deep freezer. So, you know, the story behind that is what I like to call the ice maker. And the point of this story is to show why it's important to understand that everything we do in logistics or supply chain management has to do with people. And the story kind of goes like this. I was in Kenya, and if you've ever been to Kenya, it's hot. I mean, it's really, really, really hot. It's the hottest I've ever been, was in Kenya. So we're sitting around camp, and the senior logistics officer for the unit we were working with, you know, they were charged with getting the ice maker and everything else we needed for the camp to the camp in Kenya. And one of the things we asked for was an ice maker. Now, we were thinking an industrial ice maker, something you would find in a restaurant or a hotel where they're just making ice all day. And we hadn't seen one of those. So one day, John's walking by, and I say, "Hey, John, what's going on? Have we seen that ice maker?" And he goes, "Yeah, we got the ice maker." I said, "Oh, where is it?" He goes, "Well, you see that tent over there?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You see that deep freezer right there?" I said, "Yeah, I see the deep freezer, yeah. You see the guy sitting next to the deep freezer?" I said, "Yeah, I see that guy." I said, "Well, that's our ice maker." Like, what do you mean? So what that guy was charged with doing, what he was supposed to do was fill plastic bags with water, put them into the deep freezer, and then when they were frozen, take them back out and then replace them with another bag of water so it would freeze. So we literally had an ice maker, somebody who made ice for us. Now, that wasn't the requirement the way we understood it. But however, we communicated that requirement with a vendor who understood that requirement differently. But he still fulfilled what he thought was correct, which he provided us with an ice maker. So it's just kind of a point of that story is to share with us that, you know, we really have to be clear with our requirement. Not only do we need to understand what our requirement is, but we also need to understand that the vendor or the service provider, they also understand what that requirement is. So it's very clear. Everyone gets what they want because the expectations are clear. Next slide, please. Now, the next slide kind of goes through my background. And let's see if it will come on up. There we go. So this is a slide of me and my background. It kind of starts with me in the Marine Corps uniform there when I enlisted in the Marine Corps back in 1989. And then from there I became a radio technician, was deployed to Okinawa, Japan, and that's where I met my brother. You see a picture of he and I standing next to each other in Okinawa, Japan at the Marine Corps Ball, which is a celebration we have every year. And then in the center you see me with Colin Powell, and that's when I was an embassy guard down in Santiago, Chile. I was down there for a year, and I learned to speak Spanish. Of course, I don't speak it as well today as I did back then. But I was with Colin Powell for a quick photo shoot. Took about 30 seconds. They said, "Come over here, stand here." I stood there. I said, "Smile." I smiled, and, well, Marine Corps smile anyway. And took a quick picture, and they said, "Okay, move on." From there, I was accepted to an officer program where I met my wife, who you see in the corner there on our wedding day, and I was commissioned as a Marine Corps officer, as an Amtrak officer. and that's where you see me in Croatia smoking a cigar as an Amtrak officer in Croatia, and then from there I became a supply officer. And when I became a supply officer, I realized that nothing, absolutely nothing happens in the Marine Corps or any organization without a supply chain, and it became my passion. I became a supply officer, and I was a logistics officer, where you see myself and my family right before my last deployment in 2007, where I was a logistics officer for Combat Logistics Battalion 26, and then I retired from the Marine Corps in 2010 and became and retired where you see now. Some of you may be wondering what Jack Quinn Solution stands for. Well, Jack is the middle name of that little guy down there, and Quinn is the middle name of the big guy standing next to my wife, and then Solutions is the middle name of my daughter. Her middle name is Sophia, so we have JQS, Jack Quinn Solutions, so that's how we have Jack Quinn Solutions in doing that. So next slide, please. As I came out of the Marine Corps, had the dissertation, that's where you see the book, United States Marine Corps, Supply Chain by the United States Marine Corps, and then I also wrote Supply Chain Analysis, which is a very short book that shows people how to analyze their supply chain and build a supply chain, and then we also wrote the book, How to Pass the CPSM Exams. Now you can get all three of these books when you opt in. You can go to the next slide, please. If you go to supplychainteamtraining.com, you'll get a copy of all three of these books along with a copy of these slides, so that you'll have these for your referral into the future in doing that. Okay. So, and I'll also show this at the end, so don't worry about writing it down. I'll also show it to the end. So let's go ahead and get started into the presentation about supply chain management by the United States Marine Corps. Next slide, please. So during the Operation Iraqi Freedom, we discovered several things, and it was very interesting doing this study. I was in a base unit at the time of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the war only lasted less than 30 days, and it was because they were doing a concept called maneuver warfare. And in maneuver warfare, you want to move faster than the opposition, as similar to business. In business, you want to move faster than the competition. So you want to make decisions faster than competition, you want to get to market faster than competition, and you want to serve your customers faster than the competition. So the concepts are similar when you look at them in a business context. What we discovered by doing this qualitative study, where I interviewed 10 officers from the foxhole all the way through to the logistics battalion or logistics group that was back in the United States, that logistics planning was very slow. That the speed of the logistics support was slower than the speed of operations as they were moving forward and doing things. So integration of supply chain management or the logistics information systems in the combat units was very poor, that the communication just wasn't there. However, despite this integration or lack of integration and slow planning, they were able to move 1.2 million tons of material using 2,000 trucks, driving over 8,000 miles per day in order to support the warfighter. How were they able to do that? Is that they understood the fundamentals. Through training, consistent training with everyone in the organization, they were able to master the fundamentals. And by mastering the fundamentals, they were able to work through any friction that they had or any problems that they had. They were able to work through that, and that's where they were able to master the fundamentals in doing that. Next slide, please. And what the fundamentals begin with is planning. And you can see the different slides here, and you could imagine moving all of these different things all in one coordinated effort. You can't do that unless you've done great planning. Moving ships, helicopters, trucks, hovercraft, all of these different things moving at one time, it only happens when you have very good planning. And one of the key findings of the study was that when they came together to do the planning, there were different folks involved in the planning. The Marine Corps is set up into three major groups. You have the East Coast, the West Coast, and Okinawa. Well, the West Coast was going to be the lead effort in this operation, so they were going to lead the planning. So the East Coast flew to the West Coast. And when they flew there and they started doing the planning, when they were at that planning session in the West Coast, the plan was that at a certain point in the operation, the East Coast units would displace or move from one point in the battlefield to another point in the battlefield. And that was the plan. They were going to displace and move. Well, the East Coast planners took that back to the East Coast, and when they got there and they explained that to the planners in the East Coast, the folks on the East Coast said, no, we're not going to do that. we're going to do something different. They became general support for the entire theater, not specific support for that unit. Now you can imagine that you have an entire unit planning on this one unit moving at a specific time to get closer to support. So they made plans in regards to time to support, amount of stuff they had available to support. They made a lot of plans, and then this did not happen. So there was an effect in the planning that actually caused some major issues during the operations. So next slide, please. And that's what we're going to talk about, is that even though there were key differences or key mistakes in the planning, people made the difference because they understood how to do planning, they understood metrics, and they understood how to use information technology. And that despite all of these things, even when they had problems with planning and problems with metrics, which we'll talk about, and problems with information technology, they still moved through the plan and through the operations to be successful. Now, I like to show this picture because in the middle there you have, if you go back to the one slide, please, go back one. The middle there, they have a picture of 3 Marines, and in the middle is a Marine, Staff Sergeant Dickinson, Scott Dickinson. And what happened is he was killed in Afghanistan in 2010. And I show this picture to honor his memory so that we don't forget who he was and continue to live in our memory, as well as show you the value of having someone that you work with. I knew him as a young Marine when he first came in the Marine Corps, worked with him, developed him, grew him to where he became a reliable part of our team. And again, that happened with a person, so that when we had a problem because the plan didn't work right, that he was there to make it work and become effective to do that. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, it talks about planning, and then what I show you here is a picture of the result of an operation during planning. And remember I mentioned before that at one point a unit was supposed to displace or move from one point of the battlefield to another, and people were counting on that. And what happened was there was someone in the operation, and what they were doing is they had requested 25,000 gallons of fuel. Now, even before that, when they were making the plans to support operations, they were making plans to get 45 to 50,000 gallons of fuel per support action. Whenever they requested it, they assumed that there was 45 to 50,000 gallons of fuel that they could move at any one time. The reality was that the units that could move fuel only had the capability to move 15,000 gallons at a time. So just understanding differences was a key mistake. They didn't, one thought it could move up to 50,000, the other only could move 15,000 to do that. So right there you can see a disconnection in the planning. And then the point of that is that as logisticians, as supply chain managers in business, is understanding what the customer needs and what you are actually able to do. And if you can't meet the customer's needs, it's not to tell the customer no, it's to make sure they understand what your capabilities are and how you're going to be able to still meet their need based on your capabilities to do that. And going back to the picture here, where it shows the helicopter and the tanker doing that, is what had happened is one of the people I interviewed is he was planning and he put a request in for 25,000 gallons worth of fuel. And he couldn't confirm it, and he was calling folks, using the radio, driving, confirming it, to where he finally found out that his request was not going to get filled. Now, they were getting ready to go into an operation to attack an objective, and a key component of that attack was tanks. And they needed fuel. They needed 25,000 gallons of fuel to use tanks in that operation. And they couldn't find it, so even though they needed it, what ended up happening was a helicopter flew in with 3,500 gallons of fuel during the middle of the battle, and they were refueling the tanks during the middle of the battle to do that. So through misplanning or misalignment, they were actually having to fight a battle getting fuel with not what they needed, but with what they had to get. And still, they persevered. Still, they were successful, even despite this key mistake in the planning and the logistics plan. Next slide, please. So does this apply to business? Do things happen in business that we cannot predict and then we have to react to? We can look at the slide there with volcano. The volcano in Greenland explodes every few years, and it's happened, a couple of times in the last probably 5 years, where that shuts down the supply chain between the United States and Europe. the tsunami in Japan, when it had a major impact on Japan, and it impacted all those factories in Japan where there were a lot of key organizations that were not able to get the parts they needed because the factories were shut down. And one company in particular, they had only a sole source of companies in Japan. They had no other sources. So when that shut down, there was an impact to their company, and they were unable to get the things they needed to move forward in production. So the point here is that we want to plan well, but also plan for things that we cannot predict, or what they call contingencies, mistakes, or natural events, things that can happen that we need to shift from that plan. So planning is a key piece to developing a good logistics support program. Next slide, please. And then every year, another example of planning is that, not only do you have your picture of what's going to happen, but there's also the customer's actions and what they're actually going to do. You think the customer is going to do one thing, and then the customer actually does something else. What I'm showing here is a picture of UPS. Every year around Christmas time, people rely on UPS to deliver fast, overnight sometimes, because they want to make it there just in time for Christmas. And, UPS expects this. They know this is going to happen every single year. So they plan for the trucks, employees, everything they need to meet that surge. But what's been happening over the years is that the customer has been getting closer and closer and closer to Christmas. That even though the planning for UPS is to get as many trucks as possible, there's going to be a limit to what they can actually do. So they need to start educating the customer, and that's what they did last year. If you notice at Christmas time, the TV commercials and different things were telling people, make sure you get your packages in the mail today to get a special rate today. Make sure you do it, and this was 2 weeks before Christmas. So they had time to move all of these things. So the customer you're planning is that you think the customer is going to do one thing, but then the customer actually does something different. In order to make sure you have successful planning is making sure the customer understands what they have to do to meet that requirement so you can support them properly. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the point here is that planning is absolutely essential for strategic sourcing, for logistics planning, for supply chain management planning. Plan, 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 plan. That when you plan, your planning has to do with people, smart people like you all, sitting around in a room with a whiteboard, writing things down, writing down the plan. What do I think is going to happen? What's the purpose of this plan? What am I going to do with this plan? How am I going to support them? What are my assumptions? What are my facts? And then we validate our assumptions and we work through the planning. So we're always planning, 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 planning. Next slide, please. So we want to make sure that when we get into planning, that not only do we have planning, but then we also understand what success is. And the way we do that is with metrics. Is that we want to make sure that we have key metrics in place to measure success, so that we know when we have achieved success. So that when we know that we want on-time delivery, what does that mean? On-time delivery is like right on time or within 5 minutes, or order fill rate. So to illustrate this, I'm going to talk about how the Marine Corps, what kind of metrics did they use, and how did that affect the operations that they were going through. Next slide, please. So the three metrics that the Marine Corps used were order ship time, fill rate, and readiness. Now, order ship time is when they ordered it to when it was placed in the logistics chain for shipping. The thing to understand about that is that when they placed an order, they placed it back in the States, the order was fulfilled and it was sent to a point where it was then put into the logistics chain, to where it was then going to go shipping. Well, the clock stopped when that item was delivered to that point in the logistics chain, the starting point, which was somewhere in Virginia or California. Then it was going to be put on a plane and then it was going to be sent. Well, then when it got to Virginia, that's when the clock stopped for order ship time. It didn't take into consideration the rest of the trip, getting from Virginia to Italy, Italy to Kuwait, Kuwait into Iraq. That time wasn't considered either. Okay, so order ship time from the way it was being measured and then what was actually happening on the battlefield were two different things. Probably could double that, and actually from order ship time to when they actually received it in theater. And then we had a fill rate. The fill rate was placed on the number of orders placed, how many were actually filled. To understand why this was an issue or why this was a problem is we need to understand how things were being filled or how orders were placed in theater. Now, back when this was happening, they were using an old system called Atlas. This system was developed based on COBOL programming, which was a 40-year-old programming language that they were using to do things. And they also used 3.5-inch floppy disk drives. They weren't using thumb drives at that time. They were using the floppy. Now you can imagine what the sand would do to a floppy drive would actually ruin it. So what they would do is that the person at the foxhole would receive their orders. They would place their orders. They'd have it written down to the floppy. They would take that floppy back to the unit that was supporting them. They were supporting a bunch of other units. They would take their floppy. They would receive it. They would download the data onto their system, and they would also upload data from the day before based on the status of the orders. They would look at those, and then that person would have their floppy, and they'd go back to their unit, and they would process their stuff. They say what orders actually went through, what orders were rejected because there was mistakes or wrong codes, and they would also find the status of their orders. In other words, were they fulfilled? Were they going to be filled? How much time was it going to take for delivery? And so they would go through this process every single day. So when they took that floppy, they uploaded the data, and they downloaded the stuff. Then that same unit they uploaded the data to, they would take their 3.5-inch floppy, and they would take it back and back and back. And all this could take days to when they would finally get to a point where they could then send that data via the air to get to where it needed to go. So what would happen is I would take my disk, or somebody would take their disk, they would go to that computer, they would upload, download status, they would get no status. For whatever reason, they would get no status because that data hadn't made it all the way back, they would get no status. So what would they do? They would place another order. Because they didn't want to go back and say, well, I don't know. Instead, they would rather say, I didn't know what the status was, so I went ahead and placed another order. So the same item could have been ordered 10 or 20 times before it was actually received a status. Now, the people back in the States, they didn't know if that order was the same order or if it was 20 different orders. They just continued to fill it. That's why we had a 10% fill rate, is because people just didn't know where the information was. Despite all that, they had readiness that was 95%. The definition of readiness is their ability to use their assets. So if they had 10 trucks, 95% readiness meant that 9 of those 10 trucks were ready, or they could use them, they could drive them, they could actually drive them to or use them in an operation to go do something to do that. So how were they able to have 95% readiness when their fill rate was 10%, their order ship time was so long, the operation only lasted 30 days at most, and a little bit then beyond that, but still the main operation didn't last that long. So how were they able to maintain that 95%? The way they did that was they used a concept called cannibalization. Cannibalization is when they took, say they had 4 broken trucks. They take the worst broken truck, take parts from that truck and put it on the other 3 and make those 3 good, and then they would have 3 trucks that were up and only 1 down. So that was the concept of cannibalization, and that's how they would maintain 95% readiness. Next slide, please. So what was the result of having misaligned metrics? Was a backlog of supplies, as I explained before, just a whole bunch of orders going in, and the people in the States not knowing if those orders were new or continuing orders. You can go back 1 slide, please. You know, and doing that, misaligned or backlog of orders. Wasted funds on containers. To better explain this, is what we had was when somebody shipped something, what happened in the States is they would throw all the stuff into a container, and when that container was full, they would package it up and they would send it to the port, put it on a ship, and then they would move it into operations. Well, what was happening was people were just throwing stuff into the containers. Nobody was tracking the manifest, in other words, what's inside the container. And even if they did that part, that manifest was lost in transition from point A to point B. And at one point, they were using actually electronic tags, and then those electronic tags would come corrupted, or they would fall off a container. So when they arrived in port, they didn't know what was in them, and they didn't have time to go through them to sort it all out. So what they do is they take that container, okay, we have no idea what's in there, move it over here, and they would move it over there. So, but when you have containers, not only are you paying for the container, but you're also renting the container. So when they said wasted containers, is that, one, there's only so many containers, and there were a lot of containers just being filled up and placed on the side of the port, as well as the government was paying the fees for those containers. So every day they were just sitting there being wasted, they were wasting money. They were paying demurrage on those containers to do that. Now, this was in 2003. In 2007, when I went to Albany, Georgia for my last tour, we were doing a tour of the base. And there was a part in one of the warehouses where they had all these containers lined up. And of course, I have to ask, what's going on? They say, well, those are all the containers where we have no idea what's in them. So what we're doing now is emptying those containers, inventorying what those parts are, and getting them back into the supply system so that somebody can use them. So pretty interesting that, 4 years later, they're still trying to figure out what's in those containers. I mentioned cannibalization of vehicles, where they're able to bring up the vehicles, to make 4 broken trucks turn 3 good and keep 1 broken. And then the result from the customer point of view is they have fear they're not going to get what they need. They have uncertainty that you have the inability to support their needs. So what do? They stockpile. They take whatever they can find and they hide it. So when they need it, they've got it. So they start stockpiling things. And they start going around the supply system. What do I mean by that? So instead of using that antiquated system where they're putting in the 3.5-inch floppy disk, they're picking up their own personal investment of satellite phones and calling people back in the room saying, hey, I need this, and placing their own orders and getting DHL or UPS or FedEx to deliver their stuff into the field. So they started going around the supply system. Even though they went around the supply system, they didn't cancel their orders in the system. So all this material was just going around. They were just working the system many different ways. Again, their focus was to support the warfighter, which is great, but the impact of those, that what I call lack of discipline in the supply chain, created a huge impact for the long term to do that. Okay, next slide, please. So supply chain is all about putting the right stuff in the right place at the right time, in the right quantity, in the right quality. That's what we try to achieve when we have the supply chain, setting it up, the logistics, moving stuff. And that metrics tell us what's going on in the supply chain. How well are we doing? Are we meeting the needs of the customer? Are we getting things there on time? And then we ultimately find that when people don't know what's going on, they don't understand the status of what they're ordering, it creates uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, you have stockpiling going on, and people are fearful they're not going to get their stuff, so they stockpile it, which creates waste. And from a business point of view, waste then costs profits. So you want to build a supply chain that communicates to the folks what's going on, so they have certainty that they're going to know when they need something, they get something. And going back to planning, that's why you want to include your customers, operations, sales, marketing, all these folks. They need to be included in your planning, or you need to be included in their planning, so they understand the truth and what can actually be done, not what they think can be done. Okay. Just to add another story, is we had someone in our training class in Charlotte last year, and he worked for a health product company. And he was charged with finding this natural route which was required for them to produce this health product. And sales and marketing put together a campaign. He was not included in the planning of that campaign. And then they actually deployed that marketing campaign. And then it worked. They were starting to get sales. They were starting to make a lot of sales. But because the supply chain person responsible for that key ingredient wasn't involved in it, he had no backup plans for success. So they ended up going to where they were out there and they couldn't deliver what the customer wanted. They didn't have the resources to fulfill those orders. So that's an example of why here in the business world, supply chain logistics need to be involved in the planning, the operational planning with sales and marketing. That if sales and marketing are left on their own silo to do their thing and they just throw it over the fence for us to support, then it creates problems because they may have expectations that we can't meet. And if their expectations we can't meet, then it could be very, very expensive. And loss of customers in that example, or another example, they've seen a lot of expedited cost in transportation to do that. Next slide, please. Finally, the last part of the dissertation we discovered was that information technology became an issue. What was going on at the time, right before the operation kicked off, was the Marine Corps was going through a transition to where they were using two different systems. One was the Atlas system I described before. That was 30-year-old COBOL programming, and then they were bringing on a new system called Atlas 2, which was window-based, internet-based. And right when the operation kicked off, they were both, the West Coast was on the old system, the East Coast was on the new system, and then when they finally went to go deploy during the planning, they realized they couldn't be on two separate systems. They had to be on one system. And when they did that, they realized that they needed to kick it back to the old system. So the East Coast was already on that new system for 3 years, and then they had to stop. So you had 3 years of experience, 3 years of people that weren't familiar with this old system that had to go back and retrain. It caused more uncertainty. more uncertainty. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. How does this apply to business? As you see in the slide here, BMW was going through a supply system change as well, and it was causing delays in their ability to support their customers. So, you know, the same uncertainty caused by the Marine Corps, that the Marine Corps realized during their operation, was also seen in the business world when BMW was going through a transition between one system, their old supply system, and the new. It was causing issues with their new system, was just causing delays with their customers. Next slide, please. And one of the things I like to talk about in my classes when I'm training, whenever I talk to somebody about technology, is that it's a tool, that people need to understand how to use the technology. And at the end of the day, technology, when technology fails, people have to make a difference. Whenever you look at technology, the first question you need to ask yourself is, what functionality am I trying to achieve? Based on that functionality, you want to automate it to make it faster, more consistent, more accurate. But if you don't understand the functionality you're trying to achieve, you don't understand the fundamentals of supply chain management, of logistics planning, then the technology becomes more of a you know, we call a large paperweight, meaning it's on your desk, but it can't do anything for you. It's just there. So you want to make sure that when you use technology, everyone uses the same technology, and that people understand that the information coming out of the technology and how to use that technology for the best of their benefit to do that. Next slide, please. Why were they successful? You know, they were successful for a few reasons. They had leadership, they had technology, they had ingenuity, and they had training. They had leadership, focus, training, and they were all focused on the fundamentals. They wanted and they understood the fundamentals. That, you know, technology is not part of this equation, these four things, and why they were successful. They had the leadership to make decisions. They didn't wait. They didn't blame the systems. They had ingenuity. They went and did whatever they had to do to get those requirements to the warfighter, to the people that needed those supplies so they could be successful. They had a very clear focus on what success was and what they had to do to get that success. And they had a very solid foundation in training because everyone went through the same training. Just as everyone here in your class is going through training from the University of Puerto Rico, as you start to go into the business world, into your different organizations, you're going to find everyone has a different type of training, different perspective on what they see things are going to be. So as you start to become part of those organizations, what we want to do is have everyone understand the same terminology, have a foundation of training, meaning they all understand the same concepts the same way. You know, so when I say supplier managed inventory, somebody else understands that as vendor managed inventory, that those are actually the same things to do that. Okay, so one of the reasons you want to make sure you have good, solid training as you come into an organization, find out what the training is so that you can understand what terminology they're using to do that. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So now we're to the question and answer part of the presentation. You know, it's valuable information. Of course, the question I'll ask for you is, you know, was it valuable? Did you find it valuable?
Yes.
All right. Did you see anything that you might want to implement as either in your, you know, your education career right now, or even in business, you know, for those of us that are working right now, things that you actually go out and implement right now? Right. So think about how you would implement these things. And, you know, Edgar, at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions, if anyone has any questions.
Anyone? Yeah. Go ahead.
If you mentioned that they have leadership in community focus and train, do you see another characteristics that could help that system to work successfully?
I didn't quite understand the question. Could you repeat it again?
Okay. You mentioned that leadership, ingenuity, focus, and train are simple characteristics to get to the point to focus on. Oh my God, I'm so nervous. Okay. Okay. The point of the question is, what characteristics do you think, in your opinion, are successful to have a great logistics?
So to understand your question, what characteristics do I see in successful logistics organization?
Yes.
As I mentioned before, focus and training and leadership. The key success piece is leadership, and that leader being able to communicate what is the focus, what is success, and then being able to train their people on that focus, on that success. That leadership piece is critical. And what we find is that with the folks in supply chain and their personality, that tend to have that personality, is a lot of times they're very what they call stable, meaning they're a stable personality. They don't like conflict. They like to make things right. They like to keep things going. And so what ends up happening is they tend to be a pushover. That's not really the right word or right way to describe it. Is if, say, the director says you're going to do it this way, they know it's not the right way. They may come back one time and say, well, I don't think we should do it that way, and the director says, we'll do it anyway. Then they'll say, okay, and they'll try and do it anyway, and that causes friction. So what we need is stronger leaders that understand how to communicate in a way to that director that's effective, because that director is actually making an incorrect decision, but they don't know how to communicate the information so they can get a better decision that's more effective for the organization. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it wasn't until 2007 that the inventory of so the started recently, or is it working right now? Was it implemented? What happened next?
I didn't go. It's the technology that's kind of causing a fade in and out. I won't bite. I can't bite through the screen.
That you mentioned that it wasn't until 2007 that they started taking inventory of the containers. And the question is, do they start implementing logistics recently? Is it working? Do they need more changes to the plan that you offer in the book?
So the question, if I understand correctly, to make sure I understand, is that you're wondering what happened after 2007. Have they fixed the problem?
Yes.
Okay. So what they've done, with the military, people are always rotating in and out. So people that had made mistakes in 2003 could potentially still make mistakes in 2007 or even now 2015 that we're in now. So the key to not repeating that mistake, part of that answer is technology. Do we have an ability to maintain the inventory in those containers? Is that capability there? And the answer to that is yes. We have the technology. We have tags that we can load with data. We have manual processes that we can use. Where we get into trouble is, will the people use that technology? And the planners that are planning things, do they have the right supervision in place to make sure that they do use that technology and they do collect that data in the right way? So as they start to develop a new plan and they put in place these tags to use so they can collect the data, again, it's going to come down to people, because if, garbage in, garbage out. So if they don't put the correct data in, they're not going to know what's in the container. If the data tag falls off, they don't know what's in the container. So there's a lot of other things other than the technology piece that is going to keep track of that inventory. And that's where the supervision, again, the leadership piece is going to be critical to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do. So they do that, and then the system gets better. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned that when technology fails, the people, I want to know what strategy do you use when technology fails?
To repeat the question, what did we do when technology failed? What strategies did we use once technology failed? Is that correct? Okay. So what happened was really, really interesting. So once the technology failed, what happened was people started trading and bartering. So somebody had something they didn't need, but they knew somebody else needed it. So what they would do is they would go to another unit and say, hey, I've got all this stuff. I don't really need it. What do you have? And they would ask them, what do you have? And they said, well, I've got all this stuff I don't really need, but I need what you have over there. Let's trade. So they started trading and bartering and doing that. When communication failed, you had, you know, a supply person and a security person in Humvee driving all over the battlefield trying to find stuff. They weren't going to fail. They weren't allowed to fail. They never will. But the reason because of that is because the person said, I will do what it takes to be successful, and that's what made it happen. So their strategy was to stop looking at the computer screen and start doing the communication piece and get out and talking to people and doing the leadership side. So when technology fails, what we need to do today is not send another email. We need to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. We need to get out of our office and go see that vendor, go see that customer, and talk to them face to face, and not allow technology to be an excuse. We have to use the leadership side of that. Does that make sense?
Back to this the problem you say it is because there's a lack of commitment to supervise those. The lack of knowledge of how to supervise. What is it? Why for all these years there's a problem?
The reason the problem still continues, as after all these years, and it still continues, is that one, training. Do they understand the mistakes of the past? Have they studied the mistakes of the past so they don't make them in the future? So does the leadership have this kind of training? Are they doing these kinds of things? And then even with all the training, once you have a plan and you start to execute that plan, then things start to change. And if you imagine people, we only have so much bandwidth, meaning we only have so many things we can pay attention to at one time, and we're going to focus on the things that are most important. So they're going to focus on, one, is it here? Where is it? What do I have? What can I do the best with? They're really not going to worry so much about what's going on in the States. That's somebody else's problem to do that. So when we talk about supervision, it's having clear priorities to know exactly what's important, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then making this piece here, inventory tracking, one of the top priorities. Where's my stuff? Do we have the systems in place to track it? And if the answer is no, or I don't know, or the system starts to fail, is fixing it. So, you know, this is realizing that the small problem today, well, I may not be able to track one item today. Well, that's 1 unit out of 100 units all operating, so that's really 100 missing items right now. Now it's like, okay, it's day 2. Yesterday was 100 missing items. Now today is 200. Tomorrow's 400. The next day is 800. And then it starts to build and build and build. Realizing that that small blip, that small mistake on day 1 is really a major catastrophe waiting to happen, and getting out there and fixing it. Does that make sense?
So, yeah. One last question. Now you are. Let's when you did your dissertation, you applied different concepts into the United States Marine Corps. Is there anything we can apply for Marine Corps supply chain in terms of elements, concepts that we can apply to be a better manager or planner?
Yes. Understanding the question is, you know, what lessons from the Marine Corps can we bring back into the business world?
Right.
The key thing to understand, and this is based on not only experience in the Marine Corps, but for the last 5 years training different people on how to do supply chain management, is I realized that you may have a supply chain shop or logistics shop with 5 different people in there. They all have 5 different definitions of quality. They all have 5 different definitions of order ship time, fulfillment, what quality is. They don't understand things the same way. So step 1 is doing the training where when I say tomato, you understand what tomato is, even though you say tomato. You know, understanding the differences so that there's common terminology. So training becomes the first step, making sure everyone has the same understanding of not only terminology, but also concepts. How do I apply these concepts? And we're going to do a request for proposal. One person may think a request for proposal is actually putting it in a system and publishing it out to 100 vendors. Another person may say, I'm going to do an RFP. They're going to take their top 3 vendors and they're going to email them directly. Same thing, 2 different ways of doing it. So that training becomes critical as the foundation. After we have training is having the leadership skills in place so that we can lead better, not necessarily from a direct point of view, because many times as logisticians and supply chain managers, we don't have direct authority. We work from a point of indirect authority, and we have to rely on our abilities to influence people, not only our peers, our seniors, and our juniors, to where we have to influence them in a positive way, because we don't want to burn any bridges or ruin a relationship, because you never know when you're going to need that person later down the road. So training's first. Second is leadership training, so that everyone has the ability to communicate effectively. And then after that, it's about metrics and supervision.
Excellent. Well, okay. Randy, thank you again for sharing your knowledge, for taking out of your busy schedule. I know you're very busy these days. I hope to see you again in the near future, maybe here or in Florida. So anytime, give us a call, and that's a good excuse to take a plane and go out to Florida and get unique our experience and knowledge.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, if anyone has any other questions that we haven't addressed, feel free to email me. Email me, and Edgar has my email. Dr. Soto has my email. Just email me any question you have, and I'll be happy to respond. Thank you again for this great opportunity. It was wonderful. I look forward to coming down to Puerto Rico in the near future. Just let me know when there's an opportunity, and I'll fly to you. We're having a good time. Haven't been to Puerto Rico in a while. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Bye.